I'm excited to introduce our good friend, Andy Marker, who is a park ranger here in Martinez. He's done considerable research on the Muir-Strentzel relationship and the Muir home, and he's got a very, very long career in the National Park Service. And before that, he had a very fascinating career in public service. I'll let Andy tell you about how he got to the National Park Service, but give us a warm Martinez welcome for Andy Marker from the National Park Service.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Marker. Can you hear me okay? Good. I'm what's called an interpretive ranger. That's a storyteller. It's not something, no hablo español. I'm not an interpreter, but an interpretive ranger. We're storytellers. We make history fun. We make science and biology and botany in our parks fun for visitors. You can always tell an interpretive ranger by the hats we wear. This is the Summer National Park flat hat. So if you come up to a ranger and he's got that hat on, we'll answer any questions you might have, including, where's the restroom, which is one of our most common questions. I became a ranger late in life. I've had people come up to me and say, how many parks have you worked at? I've only worked at 2 parks because I had a full career as a corporate sales executive. And then retired and became a volunteer at John Muir National Historic Site and Rosie the Riveter over in Richmond. And now I'm a permanent ranger at John Muir National Historic Site. So my career with the Park Service just started in 2016. The Park Service really couldn't function today without volunteers. So this is kind of an appeal to anybody here. If anybody'd like to volunteer at a park, we have a number of volunteers that work on our home site, our grounds, in the orchards, in our native gardens, our native plant gardens. And we also have volunteers that man the house. And I've seen a few people that in the audience today that are volunteers in the house and also in maintaining our gardens. The Park Service has about 23,000 employees. We have close to 300,000 volunteers across the country. So the Park Service couldn't function without people like yourselves. And that's how I started with the Park Service, was as a volunteer. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Strentzel-Muir presence here in Martinez. I'm surprised no one's written a book about Dr. John Strentzel and his wife Louisiana Strentzel. Because he's a very fascinating man, just as fascinating as John Muir. He just didn't write about it. So why don't we start a little bit first with John Muir is called the father of the National Park Service, also father of the National Park System, and just the father of modern conservation. So you can take your pick on what you might want to speak with him. He moved here late in life, and we'll get into that a little bit. Here's a picture of the front entrance sign. You'll notice that it is a native garden all around that sign. That's due to volunteers. I have to apologize to this group this morning. My presentation that I was going to have is in Apple application hell right now. It's the first time I used an Apple keynote presentation, and I won't do it again unless I have the proper. So this is an older presentation, but I wanted to recognize our volunteers in our native plant garden because that was grass before. And grass is like a desert to animals. It does not attract any insects. Insects attract birds. So historically, Americans had planted lawns because we wanted to look like the rich English, with their manicured gardens. We're all reconsidering that today because we've lost 5 billion birds in this country in the last 50 years. There's not enough insects out there for them to feed. So so you can do that in your own backyard, your own front yard. It doesn't have to be a huge patch, but maybe you might want to think about reducing or eliminating your lawn. John Muir National Historic Site, as everyone knows, I just made a mistake. My thing in corporate sales was to ask people or to know my audience. And I I'm lecturing here and I don't know my audience. So who has been, by a show of hands, out to John Muir National Historic Site? That helps a lot. We have a superintendent for our park, and also the superintendent is Kaylin Berry. She comes from the southeast as a superintendent, another national park, and she manages all 4 national parks in the East Bay. Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site in Danville, Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, as well as Rosie the River World War II Homefront Historical Park. Before the Spanish got here, before the Mexicans, before other European settlers, the Ohlone, specifically the Carquin Native Americans, lived in Martinez. I'm reminded that we had a terrific Italian fishing community in this town years ago. But the Carquin were fishing the Carquinez Straits as well. So it wasn't, I don't know what it was called by them, but they did sink large poles into the straits with nets strung between the 2 poles, and would catch migrating salmon coming up the straits. So it was a very vibrant community. The photo or the illustration you would have seen, if my presentation was correct, would have been an illustration of a native Ohlone in a reed boat, as well as their villages, in a setting very similar to Carquinez. And the skies would have been filled with ducks and geese, would have been fall, might have been an early run of salmon. And so life was good here for Native Americans. And the Park Service currently has, as our director, a Native American, as well as the Interior Department Secretary. His boss is a Native American woman as well. So we're very fortunate to start to review another part of our history that I'm older than most of the people here, but we never talked about Native Americans when I was in high school or college. So I'm glad that this change is happening. And we talk about it at John Muir. So come by and stop by. John Muir was Scottish by birth. This is a picture of the town of Dunbar. It was on the coast, not too far from Edinburgh, Scotland. Anybody been to? Fantastic. And I believe John Muir Association is going, some of the members are going there. And this is the line in purple that goes from Dunbar all the way over here is a John Muir Trail, John Muir Way actually, that was created a few years ago by the people of Scotland. It's a hiking path to recognize the contribution that John Muir made. The building, the Lorne Hotel, is where John Muir lived up until the age of 11, but he was born in the building to the left. And his father was a shopkeeper in the ground floor under the Lorne Hotel. At the age of 11, John Muir came home from school one day, and his father sat the family down. At that time, there were 7 children, and his mother and a father. And he said, "Children, you don't have to do your homework tonight. We're moving to the United States tomorrow." He did not consult his wife. He had no property that he bought in America. He was just going to take the whole family, pick them up, and take them to the United States. His wife's parents lived across the street. He was a butcher, and they refused to let their daughter go. So Daniel Muir, the father, took John Muir and 2 daughters and another son to the United States. They first landed in Buffalo, New York, and eventually decided they'd rather be in Wisconsin, where there were some other fellow Scots, and they settled in Wisconsin in a very rough cabin until they could build a nicer home. And I find it amazing because Daniel Muir was a shopkeeper, and all of a sudden he bought 160 acres in Wisconsin and thought he'd be a great farmer. Anybody tried farming with no experience? It's not much fun. And there, near the town of Portage, is where he first settled Madison. You can see right there, and Portage is up here. And Muir lived there for a number of years. Since he was the oldest male, he was charged with all the heavy work. His father, the real reason his father came to the United States was he wanted to follow a strict religious sect, Disciples of Christ, and pretty much left a lot of the hard labor to his younger sons. These are their two homes they had. One's the building on the right actually survives today. And the other two have no longer in existence. And so Muir lived here from the age of 11 until he was 22. You wouldn't think he'd go to college at 22. Most students here go at 18, but Muir was needed on the farm and didn't have any money to really enroll. But he was discovered because he was an inventor in his spare time. He did this in the early hours of the morning. His father demanded that he go to bed in the evening after he'd had his supper with the rest of the children, even though he might be 20 years old. But he did get up at 3 a.m. in the morning to create inventions and read. His father only let him read things like the Bible. In fact, Muir writes in his autobiography that the belt would be taken to him if he didn't memorize the New Testament correctly. Let me go back. The item on the right is a clock. There are two buckets there. The inner bucket would be full of water with a small hole in it, and there would be a counterweight right there. And as the bucket drains, the counterweight would move the arm, and that would be a clock. Pretty simple. You could adjust the accuracy of the clock by either drilling a bigger hole in the bucket or changing the counterweight's weight. The one on the invention on the left is the student desk. As you already saw, the Muir liked timekeeping and measurement devices. The student desk would have a group of books, right here and here. At a prescribed time, the device would open a book for him, would read it. The clock that he had set up on it would chime, and the book would close, and a new book would be brought up and opened. If you ever get back to Madison, Wisconsin, it's that invention sitting in the Wisconsin Historical Society. We're going to talk a little bit about Jean and Ezra Carr. The reason John Muir got into the university, he had no formal education after he left Scotland at 11, and all of a sudden he's able to enter the University of Wisconsin in Madison. These two people helped him do that. The woman on the right, it's a married couple, Jean and Ezra Carr. Jean was in those days, women weren't allowed to work, really, unless you were a school teacher. So she would take care of the family and keep the menfolk out of the bars. But she was a brilliant woman. She was a botanist by training. And Ezra Carr was a professor at the University of Wisconsin in agriculture. But Jean Carr was a judge at the Wisconsin State Fair. And Muir exhibited some of his inventions that I just showed you at the fair. It came to her attention that Muir was a brilliant individual. So she and Ezra were able to get John Muir into the university at the age of 22. He did have to take some remedial classes, and he did kind of do some self-study. We know Muir because of his talks or his travels in Yosemite, but he got to Yosemite by accident. He had injured his eye in an industrial accident just after the Civil War in Indianapolis, Indiana. He thought he might lose the sight of his right eye, and the other eye, the left eye, shut down in a sympathetic reaction. So he sat in a boarding house room for 3 weeks, not knowing if he'd regain his vision. But he did regain full vision, and in that time he'd been working in the industry, and he was probably pretty close to what we'd call an industrial engineer today, because he increased the efficiency of operations. But he realized his true love was being in nature. So he decided that he was going to walk to Florida from Kentucky. He would take a train from Indianapolis to Kentucky, walk to Florida, take a boat from Florida, the Gulf Coast of Florida, to Cuba, where he'd catch a boat to South America, because he wanted to see the Amazon. Jean Carr, who I just showed you a picture, you know, when I first heard of her, I thought, oh, she's a housewife. Not so. She wrote the president of Argentina to say, my good friend John Muir is coming to South America, could you please look after him? So she had connections. Whether it was from those faculty parties or what, I have no idea, it's not written. But she was a brilliant woman. She was a mentor to Muir throughout his life. And she comes into his life later on, which we'll get to. So Muir gets to Florida and is planning to go to Cuba, and he's still dirt poor. He's doing odd jobs at a mill in the Gulf Coast of Florida for a few weeks, but he gets malaria, and that cancels his trip to South America. And he says, I better be in a cooler clime. Now, Jean Carr has been corresponding with him all this time and saying, Yosemite's a nice place, why don't you go there? So he catches a boat back to New York and then comes to California. The Isthmus of Panama hadn't been built, or excuse me, Panama Canal had not been built, so he crosses the isthmus with a train, on a train, comes up to California, and makes his way to Yosemite, and is a sheep herder. Well, the first time he walks, again, he's a walker, so he gets to San Francisco. He's famously quoted as asking a dock worker, he doesn't like San Francisco, it's busy. It's 1868. 3 years after the Civil War has ended. And it's obviously after the Civil War, and San Francisco is a booming town, after the gold rush. So San Francisco is a booming town. So the dock worker says, where do you want to go? And Muir replies, any place wild. Any place wild. So he takes a ferry again across to Oakland, and he walks down towards San Jose across Pacheco Pass with a younger Englishman, and they walk to Yosemite. And they're only there for a few weeks. He's a sheep herder the next summer, and then he works in Yosemite Valley as building a mill, a logging mill, and lives in it, and then also lives in this cabin, which he built. And this is a drawing by Muir. In the back is Yosemite Falls, and Muir takes the stream, diverts a little bit of Yosemite Creek, which is what flows down Yosemite Falls, and brings it under his cabin. It's a dirt floor. He says he occasionally has a snake and a frog visit him in the cabin. Eventually, the owner, the person he's working for, has friends visiting and kicks Muir out of the cabin. Before I move on to this couple, Muir spends his summers, spring, summer, and fall in the mountains, but where do you go in the wintertime? Because it's snowed in there. So he would stay in the Oakland or San Francisco area. He was a boarder, and he'd be virtually what we'd call unhoused today. He didn't have a home, so he was. He himself called himself a tramp. But he's starting to write in magazines and journals for $50 an article. And remember Jean Carr, who I mentioned? Her husband has now gotten a job at University of California. It's not in Berkeley yet, it's in Oakland. And she and her husband Ezra want to entertain. And Ezra is the first professor of agriculture at the University of California. He's a little bit of a firebrand. He wants to teach practical agriculture. But the head of the university wants more of a scientific approach to agriculture, don't want to get your hands dirty type of thing at UC. And they get a little bit of an argument, and eventually Carr loses the argument. But he went ombudsman because he becomes the superintendent of schools of California. So he kind of is on the board of directors overseeing the University of California. Now the Carrs invite, because they're involved in agriculture, they all of a sudden know the Strenzels, who have a ranch here in Martinez. Now, I find Dr. Strentzel and Louisiana Strentzel's life very fascinating. As I said earlier, I'm surprised somebody hasn't written a book about it. Dr. Strentzel invented an item called carbonized bran, and for the life of me, I read about it and I never knew what carbonized bran was. It's a way of shipping fruit. It kept it fresh. Simply taking wheat chaff and burning it. So it's charcoalized. And so that will keep insects out of your fruit boxes. It will cushion it like Excelsior. And if one of the fruits starts to rot in the box, that will also protect it. So carbonized bran took me probably a year and a half to figure out what carbonized bran was. But Dr. Strentzel, like Muir, was an inventor. He also popularized the idea that oranges could be grown in Northern California. He also started the first grange here in Martinez. A grange is like a farmer's cooperative, but it's also a social organization. I'm at Granger's Wharf, ever heard of that? So that's Dr. Strentzel. His daughter, Louisa, also played at the Grange meetings. She was an accomplished pianist. He also, I don't know if this is true or not, but they say he founded the town of Crockett. I do know he founded the town of Valona, V-A-L-O-N-A, which Crockett has absorbed. If you go there, you'll find that a lot of streets are named after a Muir relative or a Strentzel relative. He's considered the father of California agriculture. His fruit, which he had over 1,000 different species or varieties, was well regarded and got top price. Early in his history, Dr. Strentzel, he was born in Poland, 1813, November 29th. 17 years later, on November 29th, an insurrection took place in Poland. The Poles rose up against the Russians. As a 17-year-old going on 18, Dr. Strentzel took part. The Poles lost. Dr. Strentzel had to flee the country. He went to Pest University, Budapest, and got his degree in horticulture and medicine. So he's a medical doctor. He came to the United States a few years later, about 10 years later. And I like to tell on my tours of the house, I like to tell people that Dr. Strentzel liked the sound of the word Lou. Some of you may have been on my tours or not. But he was born in Lublin, Poland, first Lou. When he came to the United States, his first point of entry was New Orleans, Louisiana. He went overland for a brief time to go to Louisville, Kentucky, 3. Then he went again overland to Texas, where he met his wife, Louisiana, 4. Their firstborn daughter was Louisa, 5. Now, can anybody tell me what his religion is? Or was? You got it. Louisiana his maiden name was Irwin, E-R-W-I-N. She grew up in Tennessee and moved to Texas with her parents as a younger woman. Her parents were married by Davy Crockett. They were such good friends that Davy Crockett and the Irwins came to Texas to found a colony or a town. So they would buy up land and then sell the plots. Unfortunately, Davy Crockett went up to some place called the Alamo and really didn't realize that land investment. They moved, in 1849, they came west from Texas to the gold country, not to mine gold, but as they say, mine the miners. So they set up on the Tuolumne River an inn, a store, and a ferry service, because again, no bridges in those days. But unfortunately, Louisiana got very ill, and to run those 3 things, you need a lot of hands. And so Dr. Strentzel sold that property and moved to the Merced River and bought a farm. Bad luck followed them. They were flooded out. So he again sold that and moved to the Bay Area. Where he did move to was originally Santa Cruz, but briefly didn't like the weather. Somebody told him Benicia was nice. And so instead of landing in Benicia, he landed in Martinez. He bought 20 acres. It was the first property he bought over off of Alhambra Valley Road, very near where the gravesite is. By a show of hands, who's been to the gravesite? Okay. And I will mention briefly that the gravesite is open every day, Monday through Friday, 10:30 to 4:30. The Park Service, with the agreement of the neighbors, asks you not to park in either Strentzel Lane or Sheridan Lane. So it's about a 3 to 4 block walk. Or you can call in advance and ask for a ranger tour on Saturdays and Sundays. And we'll drive you right there to the gravesite and give you about a 40 or 50 minute tour. So these are the people that grew the farm of 20 acres to 2,600 acres. And this is their first house. And I don't have the date for this photograph, but I believe it's after the Strenzels and after the Muirs. But the house built in, was their first house, and unfortunately it burned down in the 1980s. Has anybody heard the story? I'm trying to corroborate this, that the house was being remodeled, the house was undergoing remodeling, and a neighbor saw a fire and called the fire department and said, the Muir house is on fire. Unfortunately, they went to the other house, the one that's the park. So unfortunately, the house no longer exists. By the way, when the Muirs married, this was one of the wedding presents from Mom and Dad. So now we have Louis Strentzel Muir and John Muir. And this is the interesting part of the story. Remember I mentioned that the Carrs had moved west and were in Oakland, and so they invited the Strenzels to dinner. And then they also invited John Muir to dinner. And the Carrs thought that Dr. John Strentzel and John Muir would have things in common. They both like nature. They both like plants. And John Muir stood the Carrs up at the first invitation. He didn't show up for dinner. I'm not sure you didn't invite him back, sure. But she did. And John Muir met the Strenzels, and Dr. Strentzel was really liked Muir and said, why don't you come out to our house, which was the first house I just showed you, in the Alhambra Valley. And by the way, does anybody know who named the Alhambra Valley the Alhambra Valley? I see a volunteer in the back that might know, that's being quiet. No? No? It's Louisiana Strentzel that named it. Tales of the Alhambra was a popular book at the time by Washington Irving. And so because it had been named Cañada del Hambre, which is hunger in Spanish. Not a fun place to live. And you had a comment?
Well, I was trying to find out the origination of why it was called the Canyon of Hunger, and that is Spanish, and I figured perhaps a Spaniard in a land had memories of something back in Spain or Mexico where there was a famine or they weren't able to grow or capture anything.
The story I've heard, and it's not verified, is that there were scouting parties coming out from the Juan de Anza party that was in San Francisco, but they'd set scouting parties all over the East Bay. Could come right through where we're standing today or sitting today. And they could not find food for some reason. I'm very surprised because this area would have been teeming with deer and fish and wildfowl. But maybe they were too noisy. So Muir actually goes out to the ranch, to the original house, and has a meal. And in those days, very often if you invited a guest, it wasn't just for the night, or you'd usually stay for a few days because there might have been a hotel in Martinez, but that wouldn't be a good host to send your visitor down to the hotel, so you might stay for a while. And then Muir started making out more and more trips, you know, in between all of his travels across the West. He'd stop by in Martinez, and more he would stop in and visiting. Not so much Dr. Strentzel, but Louis-Strentzel. But he's not too quick on the sparking in the court, because it takes him about 4.5 years before he proposes in 1879. And that first house that I showed you was a wedding gift to the couple when they married in 1880. And just so you know, they married in 1880. The date was April 14th. In my other presentation, I had a picture of the wedding dress, which the Park Service has. We don't exhibit it because sunlight has deteriorated over the years, so it's well packaged away. But I'm sorry, I'll have to somehow get that to the John Muir Association and Historic Society, those pictures. So this is the ranch. I find it amazing that Dr. Strentzel really created this ranch in 2 parcels. Here's downtown Martinez. This is Strentzel Ranch. Right about here is where the John Muir house is. Their original house was this area. But all the way over in Valona in the Crockett area is the second ranch, and that's about 7 miles away. There's no cars in those days. So that would have been a half-day, 3 or 4 hour buckboard ride or horse ride over there. The other question I have is, who was managing those workers over there? Because it's just not Dr. Strentzel and John Muir doing the ranching. So there is Rancho Cañada del Hombre. And I should mention, this was all part of Rancho El Pinol, which was a 17,000 acre land grant that was given to Ignacio Martinez, who the town was named after. His son, Vicente Martinez, was one of 11 children. So when Don Ignacio passed away, the 11 children got 1/11 of the parcel. So Vicente got 1,600 plus acres, which is what the adobe at the site. And speaking of adobe, it has a large crack. Future plans are to repair it. We've had engineering studies last month done. It's going to be millions of dollars to do the foundation work. We have any adobe restoration experts? We're looking for volunteers. Louis and John Muir are living in the older house, and in 1882, Dr. John Strentzel and his wife, Louisiana, build this huge Italianate Victorian mansion. 17 rooms, 10,000 square feet. My wife and I just moved back to Martinez recently, and we're in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo. I'm thinking, like, I'm sure glad I don't have to take care of 17,000 square feet. So I mentioned that the property was split into 2 parcels, roughly probably 1,200 and 1,400 acres respectively. It didn't just take John Muir and Dr. Strentzel to work on the property. It would have been a lot of Chinese immigrants, anywhere from 5 to 20. And unfortunately, that period of history, 1882, when the house was built, was the same year that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in the country. Even Dr. Strentzel writes about worrying about the Chinese taking over the country. There were race riots in downtown Martinez as well as other cities on the west. And this anti-foreigners or people that look different has gone on forever. Muir writes, and we're talking about it, the Park Service will be putting up in a permanent exhibit, hopefully not too long in the future, but Muir writes about negative thoughts about the African Americans right after the Civil War when he went through the South, Native Americans in the Yosemite area, and the Chinese. He seems to change his mind about Native Americans when he gets to Alaska and sees Native Alaskans in their native environment without being a disturbed culture. It's kind of the way I felt from a personal feeling when you see your first unhoused person. They're dirty because they're unhoused. They don't have a shower to get or a bathtub to get in every day like we do. So, and I think that's part of Muir's philosophy or thoughts on it, but I can't talk to the man, so I'm not sure what his thoughts were. But he did somewhat change his thoughts when he did see Native Alaskans. But the Chinese, he comments that he doesn't think we're birds of the same feather with the Chinese, which is unfortunate. And I think that still goes on. So Muir's, after 1890, when Dr. Strentzel dies, Louisiana Strentzel is living in the house by herself. She's getting up in age, and so she invites her daughter, John Muir, and their two daughters, Helen and Wanda, to move into the house. And so they move in, and Muir is ranch manager, although he's also assigned that to his brother-in-law, John Reed. Margaret Reed is his wife, and that's Muir's older sister. And John and Margaret Reed are buried here in the Martinez Cemetery. This is a picture, well, it's a colorized picture of a photograph that was taken during that period of time. The railroad approached Muir in the late 1890s to build a railroad through his property. Muir probably realized that the railroad was going to do it no matter what, if they wanted it. But Muir, being an astute businessman and a brilliant individual, says, well, let me try and get as much as I can get for it. They're going to want the right-of-way, so I'll sell him the right-of-way. He's only got $50 in gold a year for the right-of-way. But he did negotiate that he would get free transportation for his whole family for life on the railroad, on the Santa Fe. And then he wants a station built a quarter of a mile away, which is burned down during World War II, but it's now Muir Station, the shopping center. That was the location. And then one of the things that Grange did, and we're getting back to Dr. Strentzel here, was act as a collective against the railroads, because small ranchers and farmers were being taken advantage of with shipping rates early on. So Muir negotiated to get the lowest shipping rate for his fruit. Now, fruit's a perishable item, and in the past, Muir had been taking it down to the Martinez Granger's Wharf and other wharfs. And so hopefully a ship would be leaving that day, but if it was delayed, maybe your fruit might not end up in the right condition. So getting fruit to market fresher and sooner was a huge advantage for Muir. So that's what this picture is all about. And that, not the same trestle today, but the same route. Anybody have a train running through their backyard? Of course, Muir's most famous event probably in his life was the camping trip with President Roosevelt. Roosevelt didn't like Native Americans either, so I don't know any conservationists at the time. I'm trying to do some research on that, and it's not a nice time in the period of our history. But they spend 3 nights, 4 days in the Yosemite Park, and Muir convinces Roosevelt to help him lobby to take away California's oversight of the Yosemite Valley. Some people say Yosemite was the first national park. In fact, it was created in 1864 by President Lincoln, but he gave it to the state of California to manage. And it was Mariposa Grove, the big trees, and the valley itself. Muir has previously successfully lobbied Congress to create the donut of Yosemite National Park, which was the area around the valley. So we now, at that point in time in 1903, when that camping trip took place, Muir was trying to talk Roosevelt into getting back the valley because he thought it was being despoiled. 1903 was an interesting year for Muir. I'll digress a little here. So he's in the big house with his wife, and he gets a letter from the White House. And Roosevelt, having not been elected president, but having been vice president, and when the president was assassinated, Roosevelt took the reins of president. So he was literally whistle-stopping on a train across the country running for re-election. He stopped in Yellowstone and visited and got a tour with John Burroughs. Did everybody see that picture of John Burroughs at the gravesite? John Burroughs and Muir were friends. Muir and Burroughs both went on a Harriman expedition to Alaska. It's said that Burroughs was up on deck watching a beautiful sunset. Muir came up after dinner, and Burroughs comments to Muir, and I apologize, I'm paraphrasing here, that, you know, if you'd been here 20 minutes earlier, you would have seen a gorgeous sunset. And Muir replies to Burroughs, if you'd been in Alaska 7 years ago, you would have seen a lot more. That photograph, by the way, of Burroughs was probably taken between 1915 and 1921. Burroughs lived in the Catskill Mountains in New York, so probably didn't make it out for the funeral. And in 1921 was the year of his death, so he probably visited shortly after Muir's death. And here's the man, and I'm guessing he's standing pretty much where Alhambra Avenue is, because that was where they had a lot of vineyards. We have 3 varieties of grapes growing at the John Muir, and we've planted the vineyards with the same varieties that Dr. Strentzel and Muir had. They're Muscat, Tokay, and Zinfandel, MTZ. In 2020, in the midst of COVID, the Park Service had a contractor light the house. These are the colors of the suffragettes in 1920, and this is the 100th anniversary. It was kind of a strange time. Everybody remembers that COVID. Nothing was open, but we did allow people to come into the park and look at the building from the outside. By the way, speaking of women's right to vote, Muir was friends with John Swett. His wife Mary was a very strong suffragette. He was also friends with the artist William Keith. His wife was also a very strong suffragette, but we have no writings from Muir about his feelings towards women's rights. He just didn't comment on it. Mount Wanda. This is where John would take his 2 daughters, Wanda and Helen, hiking. Louis, his wife, wasn't much of a hiker. A few years after they married, Muir took her to Yosemite. He sent back a letter to Wanda, his oldest daughter, who was an infant at the time, with a picture of him pushing Louis up the hill with his hiking stick. And you can see that in the house. It's on one of the walls. That would have caused my wife to divorce me, I think. Getting back to Mount Wanda, let me go back. That stayed open all during COVID, which was, we had some of the highest usage ever because it was a good, nice spot to, because we have counters at that site just to see how great our traffic is. But there, in 1991, we obtained Mount Wanda, and it was also through the help of the John Muir Land Trust, because at the last minute, Mr. Strain, who owned most of the ranch, asked for additional money. And if you know U.S. government, it's very slow to act on anything. So we were very fortunate that John Muir Land Trust kicked in a few extra dollars so the acquisition could go through. And what the area called Strain Ranch is several acres, came back to the Park Service due to a lease agreement in 2016. And I correct myself, I think I said 2016. And there are plans to develop that. It went out for public comment in 2023, and we're hoping that we get grants. We'll be able to create additional trails. There'll be all of our trails now are one way, where we have very few circuit, so you've got to backtrack usually. But that will allow people to do a circuit, which will greatly enhance the hiking experience. Well, also there's plans to have an education center there, but of course that all takes money, and we'll see what happens. But it's probably at least 5 to 10 years away. Additionally, an area where John Muir with his daughters hiked that was owned by John Swett, called the West Hills Farm. was given as a gift to the Park Service by the John Muir Land Trust in the last few years, and that's being developed and will have public access shortly too. What do we do on, I'm an interpreter ranger, so I talk a lot. But we also have other divisions. And right now we're studying tree pathology on Mount Wanda. We've had die-offs of trees, and we're studying whether or not it's the cause of the drought or there are other diseases. We have found sudden oak death, which is spread by California bay laurel trees. They're just a tree that doesn't die from the disease, but it does pass it on to oaks. So there is some loss of oak trees from that disease. We also do phenology studies on Mount Wanda, which is studying the life cycle of a tree via seasons. So when it buds, when it leaves, leaves, and when the trees senesce or fall off. So we're doing studies long term. We've been doing that for over 10 years, and we'll continue to do that. Basically seeing if there is climate change is affecting the life cycle of trees. So we just don't have flat hat rangers at our park. We've also got scientists. And in 2019, we opened the Strentzel Muir gravesite, where John Muir is buried. But more importantly, the Strentzel family is buried there. And as I said earlier, that's available to go on your own 10:30 to 4:30 Monday through Friday. Other things we do at the park. The gentleman on your right is my former boss, Jim McDonald. He was the site supervising ranger for years. He's leading a school tour. So we get, this time of year, we're swamped with school tours Tuesday through Thursday. And it's usually 3rd to 5th grade. And he's pointing at a picture of Muir Glacier that was done by Muir's friend, William Keith. And the ranger on the left is making sure everybody gets up to the top of Mount Wanda for a full moon hike. And we do those, well, we can't do them more than once every 28 days, but if weather permits, we do that. Another event coming up, April 20th, next Saturday, is Birthday Earth Day. We invite you all to come out and visit. It's free. Parking is at the high school, and you'll be shuttled to, and that is from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So come out and join the festivities. And then the day after, I'll be leading a nature hike on Mount Wanda, starting at 8:30. That's on a Sunday. And so thank you very much. I wanted to thank the John Muir Association and the Historical Society of Martinez for having me today. And I guess we'll open it up to questions.
Can we?
Okay, I don't know, does anybody want to handle this besides me? Yes, that's it.
Have any idea who built the packing shed?
Who built the what?
Packing shed that was
I do not know.
in this further.
I could probably do a little more research, but it's, yes, sir.
My family had connections with John Muir. My grandfather's name was George Putnam Upham, purchased 500 acres on Alhambra Valley Road. And he built a house there, and it's still there. The owner might even be in this room, I don't know. But my mother was born there, and she had two other siblings. They were friends of John Muir, and one day they went in to visit him at the house that she showed up there. My mother was 4 years old, and she sat on his lap in the front room. And I heard about that forever when growing up. And for sitting on his lap, he gave her a coin. And she's had it for forever. She's passed away. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I donated that coin to the association, the John Muir Association Foundation. And I assume they still have it somewhere.
Well, thank you for that.
At the house. So I was assuming they're going to display it somewhere.
Okay.
So,
Well, I'd like to talk to you afterwards.
yeah, that was the connection.
Excellent, excellent. Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the very first part of your lecture. Where was John Muir born in Scotland?
Dunbar, it's on the coast, about 40 miles east of Edinburgh, right on the coast.
I have one of my relatives, great relatives, by the last name is John Muir, who was born in Dundee. Not the same one I've done with genealogy, but no, I think it's interesting.
Did he live locally here?
No,
Okay. Because in my research, I found that there is a John Muir peach, and I thought, well, naturally, it was created here on the ranch, but no, it was created up in the Vacaville, Davis area. So,
yeah.
yes, in the back.
The original Muir home, is there anything there now?
The land was vacant for years. I understand about 5 years ago, somebody built a house on the property.
We did.
Was it 5 years ago or more?
We moved in at the end of 2019.
Okay. Oh, it's pretty close.
Yes.
And you're not letting tours go through their house, right?
We haven't, nobody's asked. We have the original front door,
Do you?
3 of the pocket doors. The woman who we bought the property from, I hung on to it, and tore down an old house. And she was happy to pass them on to us.
Since we're talking about old houses, the John Sweat house still exists too. Does anybody here live in that area?
I live on the original John Sweat Ranch
Okay.
in an adobe that was built by John Milliken, or A.G. Milliken, and he bought it from John Sweat.
Well, I encourage you all to give us a call and tell us your personal stories, because that verbal history, that oral history, we're going to lose. And unfortunately, in the Park Service, people like myself move to greener pastures, I guess, or promotions. It's kind of like the military. If you want a promotion, you have to go to another park. This is my background is after a career in sales. I'm here to stay. I'm not, this will be my last location. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you say something about the first settlers after the indigenous? Was it,
Who were the first settlers here? It would have been the Spanish, and it would have been people like Ignacio Martinez, who received the land grant. Apparently, to get a land grant, it was quite a process. You had to petition the Mexican government, and I know Martinez waited for years to get the land grant, and then he sent a second land grant request in for more land, and that one was granted. So I guess the Mexican government lost out on that one. By the way, the original adobe that Ignacio Martinez occupied was in Pinole, but I believe that's, I've seen pictures, but it no longer exists. Yes?
Did the ranch expand over the time, but did Muir add to the acreage, or did the acreage pretty much stay the same from the Strentzel's time to when Muir was managing the ranch? Did you understand that?
No, I forgot my hearing aids this morning. So
I'm curious if the ranch expanded considerably after Dr. Strentzel passed away and Muir was managing it.
Great question. Robert Hanna is a great-great-grandson of John Muir. He lives in the Sacramento area. 2 weeks ago, he sent me some news clippings. Pretty much as soon as Dr. Strentzel died, Louis owned all the property. Muir and Louis owned 20 acres jointly, which was a wedding gift, but the rest of the property was owned by Louis. In fact, so the ranch didn't grow, they were selling off property.
Oh, they were.
And leasing or selling off. Be quite honest with you, my feeling is that Muir was working on a farm from the age of 11 to 22. I'm thinking he probably had, maybe that's why he didn't propose so soon, that he knew being ranch manager here was a lot harder work than what he was used to. So, as I said, Robert Hanna sent me some news clippings that indicated that they had planned to subdivide a lot of the ranch. And I think that from some of the letters that the journal, Muir was fastidious about keeping journals on his travels, but we only have about 1.5 years of journals while he lived on the ranch. I don't know if they exist or if they were just lost or destroyed. It's amazing all the journals we still have. Muir would press plants because he was a huge botanist. And we still have his collections of some of this that he collected in Wisconsin as a young man. So it's just amazing the things he saved. It actually creates more questions. Alan, thank you for that question. Yes?
Willis Lynn Jepson was a 40-year botanist and biologist at the University of California,
Right.
Berkeley.
Yes.
And he also was one of the 3 founders of the Sierra Club.
Mm-hmm.
What was his relationship, if any, to John Muir at the ranch?
I don't know if there was any relationship. I haven't come across anything. The only relationship we now have is in the Jepson collection is that we've downloaded digital files of Muir's plant collection.
And the other thing is, what about the store in Tuolumne County that the Strenzels had? Do you know where that was located?
I can look it up afterwards. I'll take a look at
Okay, I think I can answer a little bit about the Jepson. I know that Jepson was a good friend of my grandfather, very close friend of my grandfather. My grandfather was a very close friend of Muir, so they probably intermixed through that relationship.
Do you mind if I mention the connection?
That's fine, yeah.
This is the grandson of William Frederick Bidet, is it?
Correct, yeah.
Who was the co-member with John Muir of the Sierra Club, but also the literary executor of the John Muir estate. So he finished the last 4 of John Muir's books, and plus compiled another one, didn't he not?
I think so. The main thing is he gathered all the letters from all around the world
Mm-hmm.
and then was able to write the likely letters. He found on his honeymoon, he walked the 1,000-mile walk and found the botanical specimens in the attic of somebody he
So after
ran
your
across. They mentioned, oh, we have something up in the attic.
So it's amazing the connections that everybody has with John Muir when you live in this community.
We have time for a few more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
He was kind of famous. Did he ever go back to Scotland? Did he ever see his mother again?
He did go back to Scotland. Muir, it's interesting in the literature, he had premonitions. When his father was ill and close to death, he felt that his father was close to death and went back and visited him. He had a very antagonistic relationship with his father, but they did make up later in life. Muir had a really terrible childhood. If you're taking a belt to you for not memorizing the New Testament, what kind of life? And Muir was also digging a well on their property in Wisconsin, and the gas at the bottom of the well almost killed Muir. Luckily, the father pulled him up, but the father wanted to put him to work back in the bottom of the well the next day, and the neighbors intervened and said no. So it wasn't an excellent childhood. You had a question?
In my understanding, Muir had a relationship with Luther Burbank, developing.
The only relationship we know, and it's funny because they were both involved in ranching, is that we have a copy of a letter. We actually have the letter, but it's a copy of the letter open to the public that has a $5 donation for his subscription to the Sierra Club. Right, directly to John Muir.
We have one more question here.
So, if Wanda got Mount Wanda named after her, did Helen get anything named after her?
There is a Mount Helen.
If
I was hoping no one would ask me that because the maps have Mount Helen and Mount Wanda in differing locations. And I don't know if anybody will ever solve that issue about which is which. Muir did not, apparently clarify which was which. All right, and I'll be around afterwards if anyone wants any questions.
Thank you so much.